The first night I walked into the Westfield Museum, the silence felt like a physical presence. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but of waiting, as if every corner of this massive building was holding its breath. The job listing had seemed perfect. Night security guard, decent pay, minimal interaction with people. Just me, my flashlight, and 8 hours of solitude walking the halls of a building filled with history. "You'll do fine," Mr. Peterson had said during my brief orientation that afternoon. "Just make your rounds every 2 hours, check all the locks, and make sure nobody breaks in." He handed me a ring of keys that must have weighed 5 pounds. And whatever you hear at night, it's just the building settling. I didn't give much thought to that last comment. Every old building had its creaks and groans, the wooden floors expanding and contracting with temperature changes, pipes knocking as the heating system cycled on and off. Nothing I hadn't experienced before. That first night was uneventful. I made my rounds through the Egyptian wing, the paleontology section, past rows of glass cases holding artifacts from around the world. The beam of my flashlight bounced off display cases, casting strange shadows against the walls. By 3 a.m., I was fighting to stay awake in the small security office, watching the CCTV monitors flicker with grainy black and white footage of empty rooms. The second night was when I first noticed something off. I had just finished my 2 a.m. round and was heading back to the security office when I froze. A sound echoed through the Native American exhibit, something like a scraping noise, slow and deliberate. I played my flashlight across the room, sweeping over the display cases, the replicas of teepees, the mannequins dressed in traditional clothing. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. The museum had been locked for hours, and I had checked every entrance myself. The sound didn't repeat, and I eventually convinced myself it was nothing. By the third night, I was becoming comfortable with my routine. Check the locks, make the rounds, back to the office to watch the monitors. Repeat. But at 1:23 a.m., I remember the time precisely because I checked my watch. I noticed something that made my skin tighten. The mannequin in the Pioneer exhibit, the one dressed like a frontier woman from the 1800s, wasn't where it had been before. I was certain it had been standing next to the covered wagon display earlier in the evening, but now it was positioned near the exit door. My first thought was that someone from the day staff had moved it after I came on duty, but that didn't make sense. The museum had closed at 6 p.m. and I had started my shift at 10. I approached the mannequin cautiously. It was just a dummy, of course, with a painted face and glass eyes that caught the beam of my flashlight in an unsettling way. I checked around the base and found marks on the floor like something had been dragged. Someone must have moved it during the day and I just hadn't noticed until now, I reasoned. I tried to push the thought from my mind as I continued my rounds. The massive dinosaur skeleton in the central hall loomed overhead, its shadow stretching across the marble floor in the dim emergency lighting. I never liked that exhibit. The Tyrannosaurus Rex seemed ready to lunge forward, frozen mid-roar with teeth as long as my hand. When I returned to the security office, I rewound the day's CCTV footage, scanning through it until I found what I was looking for: someone moving the mannequin. Except I couldn't find it. The footage showed the closing procedures, the last visitors leaving, the cleaning staff doing their thing, and then the museum sitting empty until I arrived. Nobody had touched the mannequin. Yet, it had moved. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Maybe the footage had glitched or I was misremembering the mannequin's original position. I made a mental note to pay closer attention during tomorrow's rounds. Sleep didn't come easily when I got home that morning. My dreams were filled with glass eyes, watching me from the darkness, and I woke up several times drenched in sweat. When I returned for my fourth night, I brought a notebook and decided to document the exact position of certain exhibits, just to prove to myself that nothing was actually moving. The first half of my shift passed without incident. I checked off each section of the museum on my rounds, making small notes about the positions of various displays. Everything was where it should be, until it wasn't. At 2:47 a.m., I entered the maritime exhibit and immediately noticed the change. The ship captain mannequin, which had been standing behind the ship's wheel, was now seated on a bench across the room. My notebook confirmed it. This wasn't a mistake in my memory. The mannequin had definitely moved, and this time I knew it wasn't the day staff. I felt sweat break out across my forehead as I approached it. The mannequin sat stiffly, its hands resting on its knees, glass eyes staring straight ahead. I reached out and touched its shoulder. Cold, hard plastic, just as it should be. But someone, or something, had carried it across the room while I wasn't looking. I rushed back to the security office and checked the CCTV footage from the maritime exhibit. The camera showed the empty room, the captain mannequin behind the ship's wheel, and then static. Just for a second, barely noticeable. When the image cleared, the mannequin was on the bench. The timestamp showed 2:32 a.m., just 15 minutes before I entered the room. My hands were shaking as I played the footage again. The static lasted exactly 1.5 seconds, according to the timestamp. Not long enough for someone to run in, move a heavy mannequin, and run out again without being seen. And who would do that? Why? I called my supervisor, Mr. Peterson, knowing he wouldn't appreciate being woken up at 3 a.m. When he finally answered, his voice was groggy with sleep. "Westfield Museum has stood for over 100 years, he said, after I explained what was happening. Old buildings have their quirks. Ignore it and finish your shift. But the CCTV footage, I started to say. The system's ancient, he cut me off. It glitches all the time. Look, if you're not comfortable with the night shift, I can find someone else. The threat was clear in his voice. Jobs weren't easy to come by, and I needed this one. I assured him I was fine and hung up. I wasn't fine. But I also wasn't going to lose this job over what was probably just a malfunctioning camera and my own imagination. I spent the rest of my shift in the security office, watching the monitors and jumping at every shadow. When I returned for my fifth night, I was determined to catch whatever was happening in the act. I brought an extra flashlight, a thermos of strong coffee, and my camera. If the exhibits were moving, I would document it properly. No one would be able to dismiss photo evidence. The night started quietly enough. I made my rounds as usual, taking pictures of certain exhibits for reference. The pioneer woman was back in her original position next to the covered wagon. The ship captain stood at the helm where he belonged. Even the massive T-Rex skeleton looked exactly as it always had. At midnight, I settled into the security office with my coffee, eyes fixed on the CCTV monitors. For 2 hours, nothing happened. No movement, no static, no mysterious rearrangements. My eyelids grew heavy despite the caffeine, and I found myself nodding off. I was jolted awake by a sound coming through the monitor speakers. A faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. I scanned the screens until I found its source, the gemstone exhibit. The camera showed the room from a high angle, the glass cases gleaming under the emergency lights. And there, at the far end of the room, a shadow moved. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and ran. The gemstone exhibit was on the second floor, and I took the stairs two at a time, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder as I approached, a persistent rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, like Morse code. When I burst through the doorway, flashlight held high, the sound instantly stopped. The exhibit looked undisturbed. Rows of glass cases displayed precious stones from around the world, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, all winking at me in the beam of my light. I moved slowly through the room, checking each display, looking for any sign of what might have caused the sound or the shadow I'd seen. Nothing seemed out of place until I reached the center display. The case that should have held the museum's prized possession, a massive raw diamond called the Midnight Star, was empty. The diamond was gone. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the room, half expecting to catch a thief hiding in the corners. Instead, my light fell on something that made my blood freeze. The Midnight Star was sitting on the floor in the doorway, as if someone had dropped it on their way out. I approached cautiously and crouched down. The diamond gleamed with an inner light that seemed independent of my flashlight's beam. As I reached for it, I could have sworn I saw something move within its depths, a darkness shifting like smoke behind glass. I retrieved the diamond and returned it to its display case, making sure the lock was secure. How had it gotten out? The case showed no signs of being tampered with, and the alarm system hadn't been triggered. I snapped several photos of the diamond back in its case and decided to review the CCTV footage immediately. Back in the security office, I rewound the tape to just before I heard the tapping sound. On screen, the gemstone room sat quiet and empty for several minutes. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the same brief static I had seen before. When the image cleared, the diamond's case was empty. No one had entered the room. No one had broken the glass. The diamond was simply gone. Then another burst of static, and there it was on the floor by the door. I sat back in my chair, mind racing. Either someone had found a way to hack into the museum's CCTV system and create perfectly timed blind spots, or something impossible was happening in this building at night. Neither option seemed particularly comforting. For the rest of my shift, I abandoned my usual rounds and instead sat watching the monitors, camera ready to document anything unusual. But the museum remained still and silent until morning. When the day manager arrived to relieve me, I considered telling her about the diamond, but what would I say? That it magically transported itself out of a locked case? I decided to keep quiet for now. That day, I didn't go home. Instead, I went to the public library and spent hours researching the Westfield Museum's history. The building had been constructed in 1912, originally as a private residence for industrialist Edward Westfield. After his death in 1925, his widow had donated the mansion to the city to be converted into a museum. There were the usual stories about the place being haunted. Edward had died in the house under mysterious circumstances, and rumors of strange occurrences had followed the building ever since. But what caught my attention was a small article from 1976 about a night watchman who had quit his position, claiming the exhibits moved when no one was looking. The article treated it as a joke, suggesting the man had been drinking on the job. I wondered if he had also been told that old buildings have their quirks. I returned for my sixth night with a fresh determination. This time, I had a plan. Instead of making regular rounds, I would set up a stakeout. I chose the Egyptian wing, with its collection of artifacts and mummies. If something was going to move, I wanted to see it happen. I positioned myself in a dark corner with a clear view of the main exhibit, a sarcophagus that stood upright against the far wall, its painted face seeming to stare directly at my hiding spot. I turned off my flashlight and waited, camera ready, the only sound my own quiet breathing. For over an hour, nothing happened. The sarcophagus remained motionless, the glass cases of smaller artifacts undisturbed. My legs began to cramp from maintaining my position, and doubts crept into my mind. Maybe I was overreacting to some simple explanations. Maybe the CCTV system really was glitching. Maybe a soft scraping sound cut through the silence. At first, I couldn't locate its source, but then I realized it was coming from inside one of the small display cases containing canopic jars, the vessels Egyptians used to store the organs of the dead. I raised my camera and waited, hardly daring to breathe. The lid of one jar began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it shifted to the side until it was halfway off. I snapped several photos in quick succession, the flash momentarily lighting up the room. In that brief illumination, I saw something dark and glistening emerge from the jar, something that moved like liquid but held its shape. It froze when the flash hit it, then quickly retreated back into the jar. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move as my mind struggled to process what I had just seen. The lid of the jar slid back into place as if nothing had happened. Finally, I managed to force myself to check the photos I had taken. Most were too blurry to make out clearly, but one captured the moment perfectly. The jar with its lid displaced and emerging from it. A substance that looked like black oil formed into what could only be described as a hand. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the camera. This wasn't a glitch in the security system. This wasn't my imagination. Something was in the museum at night. Something that could move through locked cases and manipulate objects. Something that wasn't human. I fled the Egyptian wing, my composure completely abandoned. Back in the security office, I found that the CCTV camera in that section had gone completely dark. Not static this time, just black, as if something was covering the lens. I checked the other monitors and found most of them functioning normally, showing empty rooms and hallways. But one by one, over the course of 20 minutes, each camera went dark until all the screens showed nothing but blackness. I sat in the dark security office surrounded by dead monitors, the only light coming from my flashlight. The museum had never felt so huge and empty, yet paradoxically, I had never felt less alone in it. Something was out there in the darkness, moving through the exhibits. And now it knew I was watching. The rest of that night was the longest of my life. I stayed in the security office with the door locked, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. When morning finally came and light began to filter through the windows, the CCTV system suddenly came back online. All the cameras showed the exhibits exactly as they should be. Nothing out of place, nothing moved, as if the events of the night had been wiped clean. I should have quit then. Any rational person would have. But I didn't. Instead, I went home, slept fitfully through the day, and came back for my 7th night. I had to know what was happening. I had to have answers. This time I came prepared. I had purchased a small digital voice recorder and several motion-activated camera traps meant for wildlife photography. If something was moving in the museum at night, I would capture evidence that couldn't be dismissed. I set up the equipment throughout the building during my first round, one in the Egyptian wing, one in the maritime exhibit, one near the Pioneer display, and one in the main hall beneath the T-Rex skeleton. Then I retreated to the security office to wait. The night passed slowly. The CCTV system functioned normally, showing empty rooms and quiet exhibits. None of my camera traps were triggered. By 4 a.m., I was beginning to think that whatever presence had been in the museum had either gone dormant or could somehow sense my attempts to document it. Then, at 4:17 a.m., all the lights in the museum went out. Not just the emergency lighting, but the power to the entire building, including the security office. The CCTV monitors died, leaving me in absolute darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I switched it on, nothing happened. The batteries were dead. Batteries I had checked and confirmed were fresh just hours earlier. In the perfect darkness, I heard it, the sound of movement, not just from one direction, but from everywhere at once. Soft footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the creak of joints long unused being forced into motion, and beneath it all a sound like breathing, dozens of breaths, all slightly out of sync, creating a whispering chorus that seemed to fill the very air around me. I sat paralyzed in my chair, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The sounds grew closer, coming down the hallway toward the security office. Something scraped against the door, once, twice, 3 times. Then silence, so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The lock on the door clicked. I hadn't touched it. The handle turned slowly, and the door began to open. In the darkness, I could see nothing of what stood on the other side, but I could feel a pressure in the air, like the atmosphere before a storm. Something was there, waiting in the doorway, watching me. I did the only thing I could think of. I spoke to it. "What do you want?" My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The response wasn't in words. Instead, my digital voice recorder, which I had placed on the desk beside me, suddenly clicked on by itself. Through its small speaker came a cacophony of voices, layered over one another, some whispering, some crying out, all speaking at once in languages I didn't recognize. The sound lasted for perhaps 5 seconds before the recorder clicked off again. And then, as suddenly as it had gone out, the power came back on. The emergency lights hummed to life. The CCTV monitors flickered and returned to their normal display. The doorway was empty. I was alone in the security office, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I checked my watch, 5:03 a.m., less than an hour until my shift ended. I could make it. I would just stay in the office, doors locked, until the day manager arrived. Then I would hand in my resignation. No job was worth this. As the monitors came back to life, I scanned each one carefully, looking for any changes in the exhibits. At first, everything seemed normal. The Egyptian wing was undisturbed. The maritime exhibit looked just as I had left it. But when the camera for the main hall came online, I froze. The T-Rex skeleton was gone, not just moved, completely gone from its display platform. I switched frantically between cameras, trying to locate it, when movement on another screen caught my eye. In the paleontology lab, a restricted area where scientists worked on fossil preparation, something large was moving. The camera angle only showed part of the room, but I could see massive bones being arranged on the floor by nothing. They moved as if carried by invisible hands, being laid out in a pattern that made no sense to me. I should have stayed in the office. I should have waited for morning. But I had to see for myself. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and headed for the paleontology lab. My useless flashlight left behind. The lab was on the 3rd floor, in a section of the museum not open to the public. As I climbed the stairs, the building seemed to hold its breath around me. Each step I took echoed too loudly. Each breath I drew seemed too shallow to fill my lungs. At the top of the stairs, the door to the lab stood open, spilling harsh fluorescent light into the hallway. That was wrong. The lab should have been dark like the rest of the museum. I approached cautiously, staying close to the wall. From the doorway, I could see what the camera had partially captured. Dinosaur bones from the missing T-Rex laid out on the floor in a circular pattern. but it wasn't random. The bones were arranged to form some kind of symbol, like a massive sigil drawn in calcium and fossilized remains. And in the center of the circle stood a figure, not human, not mannequin, something between the two. It had the basic shape of a person, but was composed of objects from throughout the museum: a face made from pottery fragments, a torso of woven textile, limbs of wooden artifacts bound with strips of fabric from the Egyptian exhibits. It stood motionless in the center of the bone circle, facing away from me. I must have made some small sound, a gasp, a whimper, I don't know. But the figure's head rotated, not like a person turning to look, but like an owl, the neck twisting impossibly until it faced me while the body remained turned away. Where eyes should have been were two ancient coins, gleaming dully in the fluorescent light. "You've been watching us," it said. The voice sounded like sand being poured onto stone. "Now we're watching you." I ran, back down the stairs, through the exhibits, past mannequins that seemed to track my movement with their glass eyes, past display cases where the contents shifted and stirred as I passed. I didn't stop until I reached the main entrance, throwing myself against the doors in a panic. They were locked, of course. I had locked them myself at the beginning of my shift. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the keys, dropping them twice before managing to find the right one. As I worked the lock, I felt the air behind me grow cold. Something was approaching. I could hear the soft sound of movement, coming closer with each second. The lock finally turned, and I yanked the door open, spilling out onto the front steps of the museum just as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away in a 24-hour diner, nursing a cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I called Mr. Peterson and quit over the phone. He didn't sound surprised. "Did you see them?" he asked, after I stammered out my resignation. "Did they speak to you?" I nearly dropped the phone. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew all along." "The museum has its own staff at night," he said quietly. "They've been there since the building was constructed. They maintain the exhibits in their own way. Usually they ignore the night guards. Usually." "What are they?" I demanded, my voice rising enough that other patrons in the diner turned to look at me. Mr. Peterson was silent for a long moment. "We don't ask questions like that," he finally said. "We just make sure the doors are locked at night, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Some guards never notice." He hung up, leaving me with a cold cup of coffee and the knowledge that something existed that shouldn't be possible. In the weeks that followed, I checked the news regularly, expecting to hear about strange occurrences at the museum, but there was nothing. The Westfield Museum continued its operations as normal. A new night guard was hired. Life went on. I still have the digital voice recorder. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I listen to the recording it captured in the security office. Audio analysis software has identified at least 17 distinct voices speaking simultaneously in the brief recording. Linguists I've consulted say they can recognize fragments of ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, and several extinct Native American languages. No one can explain what they're saying. I also have one clear photo, the canopic jar with its lid displaced, and that strange, oil-like hand emerging. I've shown it to experts who suggest it's been manipulated or is showing a reflection of something off the glass. They don't see what I see. And sometimes I dream about the museum at night. In these dreams, I walk through the empty halls, but I'm not alone. The exhibits watch me pass, Not just the mannequins with their glass eyes, but everything. The artifacts stir in their cases. The paintings track my movement, and behind me, always just out of sight, I hear the sound of bones scraping against the floor, following my path through the dreams. I don't know what lives in the Westfield Museum at night. I don't know why the exhibits move, or what they're trying to create or communicate. But I know they're there, waking up when the lights go out, taking back their space until the dawn forces them into stillness once again. And sometimes when I pass a museum during my daily life, I find myself wondering, do all museums harbor such secrets after dark? Are there things in every collection that no human was meant to see moving? I've never set foot in another museum since that night, and I always leave a light on when I sleep.